Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. With this video, I'll be reviewing the class supplement, The Gunslinger, designed by Heavyarms for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and available at heavyarms.com. This review has been sponsored by the publisher, and a review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you are interested in a sponsored review, please reach out to me via email, Twitter, or Discord, or my submission form at roguewatson.com. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. The Gunslinger is a class that has been tackled for the last couple years, I believe made famous in Critical Role, and one that gives a lot of DMs pause because maybe not want to add guns to your fantasy setting. I think it's always cool. I look back to that video game, what was it, Arcanum, that took place with a unique kind of industrial revolution setting for a fantasy world, which was always really fun. You look at like the Final Fantasy worlds, which always do a cool job of having like kind of steampunk technology in their worlds. Now what's interesting is you can have this Gunslinger class and not actually have them wield guns, which feels weird, but there's actually a sidebar in here that specifically mentions the fact that, hey, if your GM or DM is really not comfortable with the idea of guns in their fantasy world, then you can just use this class and use a crossbow, which reminds me of, is it Men in Tights, I believe, that has one of the villains like pulls out what looks like, it's the Robin Hood story, and pulls out what looks like a pistol, but then it like flicks open and it's a little hand crossbow. That's how I imagine this character would operate. So it really is, I think, pretty well balanced. The class supplement includes new firearms and kind of rebalances those firearms a little bit better. And the class itself is an attempt to design the Gunslinger without a bunch of trick shots. And it does that by focusing on critical hits, which is fine, and I think it works pretty well. Overall, the class comes off a lot simpler than other gunslingers I've looked at, which is not in any way technically worse. And it borrows from, surprisingly, the monk, if anything, by using grit points, which are kind of functionally similar to key points in order to fuel some abilities. My main concern is that using those grit points isn't as dynamic and interesting, I think, as it could have been, compared to using key points or using, Bardic Inspiration or whatever the Battle Master die is called, I forget, but those are kind of the gold standard for like having a resource that's actually a die, a D6 or D8 or whatever, and then you get to roll that to do the thing. Grit points, that is not the case. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. So the Gunslinger, D8 hit points, you've got light armor, proficiency, weapons, just simple weapons, but you do have firearms, obviously, and whips. Saving throws are dexterity and charisma, which feels fairly appropriate. And your highest stats should be dexterity and, I believe, actually wisdom. It would have been nice to have maybe a separate subclass that actually scales off of charisma versus wisdom, because I do feel like that could be a big part of the classic gunslinger mythos. Although, now that I think about it, I don't know if D&D ever does the, hey, this subclass uses a different stat like Pathfinder does. I don't think they do, but your grit points scale off of wisdom. Your main thing is that, and this is a full class progression, level 1 through 20 includes 5 with the fully loaded edition. There are 2 different editions you can purchase at heavyarms.com. One of them is a standard edition, which includes the whole class plus 3 subclasses called Gunslinger Trails. The fully loaded edition includes 5 subclasses as well as a bunch of magic weapons, and feels like the more complete product, unfortunately. So at first level, you get Deadeye, and this is what kind of defines the class, which I appreciate that it's pretty front-loaded, as being all about critical hits, which means anytime you hit somebody, your critical range goes down by 1. Now, what is a crit range? That means normally everybody, I believe, except for whatever that one subclass of fighter is, champion, I think, you score a crit if you roll a 20 on your d20 attack roll, right? Well, Deadeye says that every time you attack, your crit range goes down by 1, meaning if you attack once, the next time you attack, you now crit on a 19 or 20. If you hit again, then your next crit range is 18 to 20. Like, it literally just keeps going down, so you become more likely to get a critical hit. Now, if you ever miss your attack, or you do not attack, kind of similar to the Barbarian Rage rules, or become incapacitated, then you lose that benefit. So it goes away. You kind of have to have a streak going. And it caps out at 16, which is still pretty huge, right? 16 to 20. I don't know what the math is there, but before you were at a 1 in 20 chance to crit, now you've got like a fucking 1 in 4 or something crazy. So you're really good at getting more critical hits, which is great. Also, at first level, you basically get the savage criticals from the half-orc trait, which is every time you get a crit, you get to roll an extra weapon die. I believe you cannot. I was thinking, oh man, you could be a half-orc gunslinger, but then if you look at half-orc, it's only melee weapons do you actually get that off, whereas this one is specifically for your firearm. So you get better, more frequent critical hits, and you do more damage on a critical hit. And that damage scales similar to a rogue's sneak attack, which is called Bad Medicine. So, and additionally, you get to roll 1 extra dice, but pretty soon, you can see on this table, you start rolling 2 extra dice, 3 extra dice, 4 extra dice. It really becomes similar to doing a sneak attack from the rogue. Now, the breakdown is interesting because the rogue sneak attack scales up faster than the gunslinger's does, but remember, the rogue's sneak attack is always a d6. The gunslinger just says you roll another weapon die, and your weapon could be a pistol, which I believe is a d8 in this version, or a rifle, which is a d10. So that is a lot of high number of dice to be rolling on these crits. You're rolling essentially an extra 4d10 on a crit at 10th level, which is pretty gnarly, and keep in mind, you are critting more often. So automatically, that's a pretty cool synergy right there. It's not the bad thing is, as much as these things are powerful and mechanically sound, they're not necessarily dynamic. It's nothing that you are necessarily doing or choosing to do, right? You're just rolling and hoping to get those crits and hoping to not miss attacks. And that's really all your decision making is at the very beginning. At second level, you get your grit, which are a bunch of points you get, which are scaled to your wisdom modifier, and you can fuel several abilities. Now, when I first read about this, I was like, okay, cool, this is where your different cool abilities come from, even though the designer specifically said they didn't want to do trick shots. Instead of working like the Battlemaster maneuvers or the Arcane Archer arrows where you get to pick and choose, it's more like a monk's key points in that you get specific abilities when you level up that you can spend your grit points on. So at level 2, you have 4 different abilities that you can expend your grit points on. One of them allows you to heal yourself. Essentially, it's a mini short rest. You can use hit die in the middle of a battle, which that's fine, doesn't seem too game breaking. Bullet time, you can impose disadvantage. Does not require a reaction. You just instantly spend a grit point and impose disadvantage on somebody who's using a ranged attack on you. That's kind of a cool, flavorful thing. Covering fire, you can do it to somebody else. You can impose disadvantage if somebody's attacking somebody else. That one does require your reaction, so you are limited. And then dodge roll, you can very much feels like a video game maneuver where you move 10 feet without provoking an opportunity attack. Also feels very, very helpful and useful. So all of those are great. Notice how none of those actually involve rolling dice. Okay, technically, if you're healing with hit dice, I guess you are rolling dice there. But none of those are attacks or... and grit points again are like key points and not like the fighter ones, so they don't give you a dice to roll inherently. Now, unlike key points, you get them back on a short rest. Unlike key points, you also get them back if you crit, which is obviously great synergy for the Deadeye ability because you're going to crit more often. So every time you get a critical hit, you actually regain a expended grit point, which is, I think, a cool additional flavor that makes that even more useful and allows you to do all your different things, but still keeping it pretty simple. So that's pretty enjoyable. The big bummer is that the grit stuff never gets super dynamically interesting to me. That lets you, again, maybe I am looking for trick shots, but something that you can spend that gives you extra, maybe targeted attacks or something interesting that's more tactically satisfying and rewarding versus you get advantage on this or you're getting disadvantage. Like one of them, 7th level, you can spend a grit point to add your wisdom modifier to the roll. Well, your wisdom modifier is always a set thing, right? It's similar to the Paladin's channel divinity where she can add the her whatever it is, charisma modifier to her attack rolls. It's the same thing here, except you can do it as not even a reaction, but just if you miss, like, oh, but I missed by, I think I missed only by 3, then I can spend my grip point to add my wisdom modifier. But it still feels like, oh, I want to roll a dice, I want to spend the thing to roll a dice to be able to get that attack. That makes it more exciting rather than like, okay, I'm going to get my 3 points in here. Or at 9th level, you can spend a grip point to make a save with advantage. So technically I'm rolling again with advantage, but it's mechanically sound, but it doesn't feel dynamically interesting there. The other abilities are you get extra attack, so you're not a spellcaster at all. You're definitely a ranged attacker, so play that up a little bit better. You gain advantage on initiative at 2nd level, and there's a lot of stuff about free drawing your weapon, which as a DM I never really care about that anyway, but it's still pretty sound. And then as part of rebalancing firearms, they have the loading property, I believe, in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Which means you can never make more than one attack. Well, how does that work when you have extra attack here? Well, also at 5th level, you can reload your firearm. So in here, I believe they don't have the loading trait. I believe it's just the reload. So instead you have reload and you have a certain amount of shots. And the reload takes either your action or bonus action until you get to 5th level here, which lets you reload as part of your move or your action. So you have multiple avenues to reload, but you also have 6 shots. So a lot of combat, even if you're multi-attacking, you have to go, 3 rounds before you have to worry about reloading. So it's almost not even a thing for the gunslinger to worry about. But on the other end, I believe the weapon die has scaled back down, which puts them a little... The balance felt pretty sound. Now, I haven't played this character. I can't comment on the balance level, but from what I can tell, the designer really did... do the work to try to make firearms more balanced in a world where, especially like not everybody's running around with guns and everything, but people running around able to shoot fireballs out of their wands and shit. So I don't know. I like it. I'm personally a fan of introducing at least like Renaissance era firearms or the like 16th century whatever firearms, muskets and stuff, gunpowder into the fantasy world. I think it's really exciting and dynamic and feels like a really cool time period, but not everybody is, so it's totally up to you whether you even want to use that stuff. But the information that's here, I think, does a really great job with that. Also, similar to a previous product I reviewed, the Dancer class, I didn't feel like the top end abilities were super exciting for being such a top end, like, oh, I get to get all the way to level 20 in this class. The 18th level is you get to regenerate 1 grip point automatically every turn. That's fine. I mean, again, mechanically sound, but not super interesting. And then the 20th level, you have advantage on your attacks if your crit is 16 or lower. So if you've managed to hit that really good crit level, then all of a sudden you have advantage on all your attacks. Okay. Again, you're not really becoming this embodiment of amazing. I would have just fucking slow time and fan the hammer and do all that, because that would have been really amazing. But a lot of those Western tropes and ideas are present in the subclasses. And I do think the subclasses do a pretty solid job of embodying all those familiar Western tropes that we all love. Although I still think we could have used a gambler. The Maverick class is supposed to be kind of the outlaw, Western, either hero or anti-hero. I do love that when you roll initiative, you can spend your grip point as your reaction to instantly make a weapon attack. So just that fast on the draw. I think that was actually a really good mechanical way of, like, how do you do that like classic duel maneuver, but with a party setting in a turn-based, combat scenario. And I think that does a pretty cool job of doing that. And then you can pick up nearby objects and throw them in people's faces and blind them, which seems very niche. And I think this ability could have been worded better. It literally says you use a bonus action to dash an object. Don't use dash because that's a separate action. But I think I get the idea behind it, which is like you're throwing a cup of, whiskey or somebody in somebody's face and they have to be blinded. Maybe that could have been expanded to be like they could be blinded or knocked prone or been I was gonna say dizzy, but I don't know if that's an actual status effect in 5e. But different status effects that you can just do as an extra, thing. I think could have been fun. You're using your environment. It's the pocket sand, I think that's a good embodiment of the Maverick for sure. The Beast Rider is not what I wanted from a. You think of a lot of the Western heroes and they're tied to specific named horses. Your mounts. And in this case, it says, well, you can just basically charm an animal using your wisdom modifier, and you charm them for 24 hours. You've got, restrictions kind of similar to a druid's wild shape. I would have rather redesign this as you have a animal companion similar to the druid or ranger, and that companion, scales with your stats, and maybe you can summon them, because the Red Dead games, I love the ability where you're just out in the middle of fucking nowhere and you can hit a button and your horse comes trotting from off screen. Like, that's so fun and helpful. And a big part of that game is, yes, you can go out and get horses, and then put them in your horse garage stables and make them your own horse, and then you become really attached to that animal, right? And that's actually a big part of Red Dead Redemption 2, the story at the end, is you become really attached to that animal. So I think that's missing here in the Beast Rider, is reflecting the fact that you and your horse should be good buddies, and I would have rather had a more powerful animal companion that is, scales with me and is memorable and all that, rather than just being able to go around and like charm different creatures. So a little bit of a miss on that one. The Enforcer is your classic, like, wider lawman, which is definitely a trope that I'd want to hit. In this case, you've got really good insight because you need to be able to read people, and you're not tanky, but you've got a really interesting synergy with healers in that anytime you regain hit points, which, keep in mind, all the gunslingers have that buck up ability, so they can spend a grit point to roll their own hit dice to heal themselves. If you do that during combat, you gain temporary hit points equal to the amount of health you just gained. So you get to gain a little bit of a shield, which is very cool, right? That's a good way of reflecting the fact that you gain a little bit of tankiness without just saying, oh, I get, medium armor proficiency and better armor class, so that really feels like you're having to do a thing, you're having to heal yourself, but then that also gives you that kind of overshield. So I thought that was a really cool ability that reflects the fact that you are a lot tougher, and then the other abilities just kind of add on to that. You gain different, buffs and stuff for whenever you heal and all of that. So that's what you get basically with the standard edition. I believe you do get the firearms, and yeah, so you get the firearms. The new ones, which again rebalances them so that the pistol sidearm, in fact, is a D6. The hand cannon's a D8, and then the rifle and shotguns are D10s, which I believe is lower dice on all of those compared to what's in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And then instead of having the loading property, they have the reload property, which gives them a certain amount of shots before you then have to spend an action or a bonus action to reload them. Or again, when you make 5th level, you can also use your movement to just sit there and do it. So it seems to be a little bit better balance, but obviously I'm not playing the character, so I'm not really involved in all that. So if you get the fully loaded edition, you get an extra 2 subclasses, as well as new magic firearms, magic items basically, and firearm modifications. So and unfortunately, the other 2 subclasses are a lot more interesting. The Preacher and the Revelator. The Preacher gets cleric spells, and kind of the classic, like, Old West, like you've got the the Man of the Cloth, and you're hunting down. Well, in this case, it's really taking that archetype and splitting up into 2, because the Revelator is the more offensive one, and the Preacher is more of the actual, like, healer person. So the Preacher, you get cleric cantrips, and you also can use your self-heal onto others. So you're using that buck up to heal other people, and then when you do that, they gain different benefits. I believe you can cure conditions at 10th level, and you gain all of your hit dice back in a long rest. That's not terribly exciting, but I guess that could come up in certain areas. At 17th level, you can straight up resurrect people, which seems crazy powerful. As long as they haven't been dead for more than a minute, you can just use your heal other ability to just fucking res people, like with no, just once per long rest. Like, that's very powerful. But again, 17th level, whatever, fuck off. It's tier 4. The Revelator lets you replace your normal damage with radiant damage. I believe you have to use an action to do it, but it lasts until your next short rest. And then all your abilities kind of work with that. So you can roll extra damage by spending your grit points, and you can shackle any, like, demons that try to escape from you. You're supposed to be hunting specifically, like, undead and fiends, I believe, which to me is a really cool archetype for specifically, like, a fantasy, like, Weird West gunslinger. I really like that. So those are both more interesting classes that kind of play with the fact that this, you're playing a gunslinger in a fantasy world, so you're probably going to run into more exotic abilities and things. And it's a shame that that's locked behind the fully loaded edition, because those are both really cool subclasses. We already went over the firearms. We do get some new feats which play well with the firearms and don't do any of the gross like sharpshooter bullshit that just kind of breaks archery in 5e, but instead lets you have your own like, oh, you know, you can attack prone without necessarily losing disadvantage, and you can be prone without imposing disadvantage, and all these different things, which definitely helps. The Appendices is great in this class supplement because they really do provide a ton of information and content. I love this breakdown of DPR, this damage per round, which tells me the designer really did the fucking work to balance the not only the gunslinger but also the firearms, the feats, like all of that, and compare that with similar classes that were literally built to deal the most amount of damage as possible with or without certain feats. In other words, a battle master wielding a longbow, a thief wielding a crossbow using obviously sneak attack, and it even says like, okay, here's how often the you know, on average the thief would be able to sneak attack, or rogue, I guess. Can you not use rogue if it's not on the DM? That's interesting. Anyway, you know, how often they can use sneak attack, how, you know, and if they've got sharpshooter, what does that do to the damage? And the breakdown is awesome here. Like, I'm not even going to try to second guess the math because that's not what I do, but that to me is a great way of allaying any fears about, you know, if you wanted to come to your DM and say, I want to play a gunslinger, DM's like, fuck no, I'm not going to let you wield guns in my universe. And you're like, well, look, even best case scenario, here's the damage I can put out compared to other like min-maxers, because that's probably what you're afraid of. And I think the results are pretty good. Like, yes, there are some instances where you're going to deal more damage. Mainly if the others don't have feats, I think you deal more damage at a lot of different avenues. But compared to anybody who's really tricking themselves out with all kinds of feats, you're actually never, I believe, at any point going to deal more damage than a battle master who's like built for it. So that's really fascinating and a really great breakdown, and a huge thumbs up for you know, I again, assuaging any of those fears about running a class that could be overpowered just because people are afraid of, you know, adding guns to that universe. Magic Firearms are a lot of fun. They provide a lot of neat abilities. Again, this is only with a fully loaded edition, but it's always nice to have when you add a new class to add class-specific magic items. All of them are guns, which I think is a little bit of a misstep. I think you could have definitely added like some, you know, hats or dusters or badges or, you know, something else that would be part of an iconic uniform that could do things. Obviously, having the firearms is really great because firearms don't normally appear in the Dungeon Master's Guide or anywhere for magic items, but it would have been nice to have more than just firearms. But there's like a Ghostbuster gun that can attack the ethereal plane, the boomstick, which can cast fireball. Obviously, a lot of references to different pop culture stuff. One gun is called Good Medicine, which is interesting because if you get a critical hit, you can actually shoot an ally, which heals them for that amount instead of dealing damage, which is pretty cool. There's also some that force a con save, or you'll be reduced to 0 hit points. Which the funny thing about that is, if I ran this class, I would have to change my own house rules, because we have a thing where if you get a critical hit, the other person has to make a con save, or they roll on that massive damage table from the Dungeon Master's Guide, which I think we've slightly modified, which can result in somebody falling to 0 hit points. That would be like game breaking in a class that would be able to crit this much. You'd be able to constantly, it'd also slow things down, constantly making the con saves and doing things. So it wouldn't necessarily play well with that, but I do like that there's a lot of guns here. Probably would have been nice to have something other than guns. And then fire modifications, if you specifically have Heavyarms Complete Armorer's Handbook, which was one of my favorite products when I reviewed it last year or 2 years ago, I forget. I've been doing this for a while. Which was just incredible way of allowing your martial classes to spend their money on upgrading their weapons. Same content is here for the firearms. I believe you don't even technically need the Complete Armorer's Handbook to take advantage of this, but it wouldn't probably make too much sense to you if you didn't have it. So it's just kind of an additional thing where if somebody really likes their weapons and they've got the money, and there's a little bit of a system there where, it costs, a certain amount of upgrade material and all that, then you can get the nice little modifications and add it onto your weapons, which I think makes even more sense than every other weapon, because as we all think of, the Fallout games or whatever else where you're clicking on different modifications and using that. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for the Gunslinger. Pros: 3 or 5 of the fully loaded edition, subclasses that embody familiar Western archetypes. Pro: it provides and rebalances firearm weapons, and with the fully loaded edition, you get mod upgrades as well. A dozen magic firearms, fully loaded edition only, unfortunately, but that is a cool addition. I would have liked other magic stuff, but it's all of that is extra when it comes to a class anyway. I don't expect to get any of that stuff, so it is really nice when I get it. I'm not going to put that as a con that I only got firearms. Instead, it's a pro that we got that at all. In Pro, the damage per round analyses and comparisons and a FAQ, all of which help smooth over any balance concerns. Because I think more than any other class, this causes a lot of DMs to kind of, have that sharp intake of breath because they're really worried about adding them there. And there's a sidebar in there that says, hey, if your DM if it's not a mechanical thing, but it's a theme problem where you don't want to have, guns in your fantasy class, which is totally, hey, there was no guns in like the Tolkien setting, like in most fantasy worlds, like that's totally fine. Then you can still run the class, but just use a crossbow, and it even has rules in there that say, hey, here's how you replace this stuff, and you change just a few things here and there to make it make sense to use crossbows instead of guns, which is awesome. Cons, the grit stuff doesn't excite me very much. I like the focus on critical hits. I think that works pretty well, and it synergizes very well with the rest of the class. The grit points as basically key points. Even when you're spending key points, you're doing things like Stunning Strike, you're doing Flurry of Blows. It feels a little more dynamic and interesting versus what's happening here, which is you're mainly imposing disadvantage. You're kind of using hit dice to heal yourself. It just doesn't feel quite as interesting or tactically satisfying. I would have liked to either pick and choose, which I guess that's getting into trick shots, or allow you to, well, again, it's just trick shot. Yeah, trying to come up with a way you can spend them and make it a little more interesting. Like you can at least do targeted shots and maybe have, knock people prone or make disarm them, like do different like cool abilities. I guess it's still fucking trick shots. I don't know, but just make it more dynamically satisfying to me. I think this kind of overcorrects too much. This one feels like almost the champion fighter of the Gunslinger, where you're really taking the most simplest form of the class and running with it. Still balanced and still works well, but maybe not the most, for me, tactically satisfying class to play. I'm kind of rolling that all up into one. Con is saying grit points rarely involves rolling dice. I think that's the biggest thing. And like key points, where I feel like it would have been more exciting if you had dice to roll with all these different abilities somehow, versus, especially like spend one to add your wisdom. Would have been more fun to like spend one and roll another dice and see if you hit them like that way. That kind of thing would have been more interesting to me. And I do have another con, which is to say the fully loaded edition feels like a more complete product. Your mileage may vary, and as somebody who plays a lot of video games and knows all about the standard and deluxe and collector's edition, all that bullshit, it's a thin line to walk where you add extra stuff if people want to go the extra mile, but don't feel like the other one. It doesn't feel like you've taken stuff away from the standard edition. And in this case, unfortunately, I think that one does flirt a little too close with that. And it does feel like comparing the two, the fully loaded edition is far more superior and has a lot more awesome content, especially the fact that the two subclasses just feel like a lot more interesting to me. I do think that's a bummer. The fact that the fully loaded edition just feels like the way superior version that has more content instead of just like fun extra goodies that I feel like those, better editions should probably stick to. Final verdict, a worthy pass at redesigning the Gunslinger that focuses on more frequent and powerful critical hits over trick shots, but lacks in exciting maneuvers and dice rolling. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel, and you can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson.